Okay, in about 5 seconds. All right, Angela, you're good.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome from good evening from New York, and welcome to the Explorers Club celebration of World Water Day. We're bringing a great program, I think, tonight. We're going to be bringing together 4 minds who have basically spent their time looking at water in all of its different forms. We're going to be kicking off the evening with Allison Jones, the founder of No Water, No Life, and also an amazing photographer in her own right. And she will be giving us a little bit of a background on why we're celebrating World Water Day. We're then going to venture into a suite of moulins. And I always thought of a moulin, the Moulin Rouge, what is that? Until I realized that there are vast blue rooms in the Greenland Ice Sheet that are shedding light on why it's melting as fast as it's melting. And it's the most gorgeous, horrifying thing going on the planet. And so we will be joining ice climber Will Gadd and glaciologist Jason Gulley and Matt Covington, who have been doing their groundbreaking paper, was just published like 3 months ago, and they are the cover story of the winter issue of the Explorers Journal. And then we are going, and that will wrap up the program. I do want to give a huge shout out to the social media people, John Brainerd and everybody at Red Bull, who gave us the license to run some of the most extreme footage you're probably going to see in a long time. I gather there were a lot of licensing hurdles, and they whitelisted us, so you're going to see things you don't get to see all the time. And anyway, I hope it'll be very exciting. So at this point, Allison, I'm turning the evening over to you.
Thank you, Angela. And I'm really happy to be part of tonight's UN World Water Program, since I've actually celebrated this day for years. And that's because my project that you just mentioned, No Water, No Life, has a matching focus. Using an expedition-based approach, No Water, No Life documents our watersheds and freshwater resources by combining the powers of photography and science. Thus, in leading 70 expeditions to 6 river basins in North America and Africa, I've paid attention to many local voices of the river, interviewed hundreds of watershed scientists and stewards, and taken over 100,000 water-related photographs. So here are my thoughts for tonight. There we go. On our first No Water, No Life expedition in 2007, we documented the Columbia River Basin from its glaciers to the Pacific Ocean. And there I interviewed and began a great friendship with Ray Gardner, chief of the Chinook Nation. So being with 3 rivermen tonight, or rather renowned glaciologists, is my idea of a great way to spend this evening. The UN created World Water Day 28 years ago to bring global attention to water as an existential issue that affects each one of us. We're all in this swimming hole together, whether as people or as thousands of salmon migrating upstream to spawn. The focus of No Water, No Life, like Water Day, is to share our watersheds' values and vulnerability, assess threats to watersheds and freshwater resources, including glaciers, and support sustainable watershed management solutions. The World Water Day 2021 focus is on valuing water, because realizing what water means to us and how it benefits us can spur us each to do more to protect our freshwater resources. Having clean, fresh water is something most of us tonight take for granted. Yet it's not available for so many people, too many people, even in the US. During California's 7-year drought, this boy's family had no water for over 1 year. They showered at the local high school. Flint, Michigan residents still suffer from 5 years of drinking water from lead-lined pipes. What I've learned during my No Water, No Life project is that having clean water for all depends on the health of our ecosystems. This eco-reality began to hit me in 2003 while climbing Kilimanjaro. We trekked past its Greenland Glacier, even then a remnant of the famed ice sheet that used to glisten across equatorial Africa. But today, Greenland Glacier is a visible and measurable icon of climate change. A few months later, I was wearing crampons in Argentina, staring down a hole into Patagonia's Perito Moreno Glacier. The next year, I was a co-pilot in a Cessna flying low for months over sub-Saharan Africa. I saw a brown continent now and then accented by a few green ribbons strewn across savannas and miamba woodlands. Those ribbons are Africa's rivers and lake shores. They were the only places we saw life. It was so clear. Where there's no water, there's no life. Yes, I had a title, and with that, our project evolved, covering many aspects of water. No water, no food, no life. No water, no forests, no life. And as Nobel Peace Prize winner Wangari Maathai told me, Allison, your message is no water, no life, no peace. This year's World Water Day is focused on the value of water in our daily life and work, in our cultures and communities, in our health and well-being, and in our local and global environments. The value of supporting the human right to water helps ensure environmental justice and helps maintain global stability. This week, I asked No Water, No Life Facebook followers what one phrase they'd choose to describe water. They answered, wet and amazing, prosperity and peace, the universal solvent, and the source of life and reproduction. The answer that really got to me was everything. Everything is water. Today, from the US to Ethiopia, scientists and stewards agree that if we more consciously appreciate having available clean water, we'll be more effective in safeguarding water supplies for all. Being conscious of the value of clean water can lead us to reducing pollution of our rivers and lakes, starting in the US, from uncontained piles of asphalt on New Jersey's Raritan River to leaking oil tankers in the Mississippi River Delta. As a schoolyard mural in Portugal says, if only civilization did not bring pollution. Such concerns from our youth must also prompt us to fight climate change. Think of and thank Greta Thunberg. In the last 6 months, over 10 million people were displaced by climate change-induced events that threaten our economics and our peace. But if we stabilize Earth at a safer average temperature, we can reduce the threats already melting our glaciers and burning our forests that store fresh water for us. If we accept our need for water, we'll more readily reduce excessive consumption of our natural resources. So let's show some love for our wetlands and deltas and other sources of fresh water. I've been known to say, save water and it will save us. Let's each keep asking, how can my consumption have lower environmental footprints? My answers are to reduce our fossil fuel dependence and conserve water. When in Canada documenting Columbia ice fields receding Athabasca Glacier, I interviewed UN Decade for Life Chair Bob Sanford, who said, the first place to find adaptation strategies for climate impacts is in the most concrete thing that you can measure, and that's water. So what is our human responsibility to preserving water supplies? How do we face that in the face of climate change, and how can we meet even greater water demands with growing populations? The solutions must come from nature as well as protect nature. But we must get to it right now because insufficient water supplies exacerbate so many other issues: racial and gender equality, access to education, subsistence and commercial agriculture, and disputes over riparian rights from tribal to international levels. In fact, the word rival stems from the word river. Rival originally referred to those fighting for access to the river for their water needs. Finally, there's a tie between a lack of available clean water and health and sanitation, especially during our COVID panic. How can people wash their hands to prevent COVID if they have no clean water? Okay, it's now spring, and I'll close by again quoting my colleague Bob Sanford, who claims, "Spring happens all at once. Snow turns to rain, plants bloom, animals come out of hibernation, and insects appear out of nowhere. And just as spring happens all at once, so does climate change." He then warned, since climate change effects are all happening at once, we don't know how they will hit nature's systems that previously relied on a stationary climate. We aren't sure what will surface, what will emerge, or what will grow into a catastrophe. Bob's metaphor explains why No Water, No Life promotes the voices of our scientists. They will be the first to understand what's under the surface of climate change. And tonight's three glaciologists have seen what's under the surface of melting glaciers. So my message this evening is no glaciers, no water, no life. Happy Water Day, and thank you.
Thank you, Allison. It was fantastic. And what a great introduction. Before we get to our three speakers, once again, I would like to say thank you, Red Bull. And I think we can say, let's roll the videotape and we'll see you on the far side.
That is a lot of water. That is a big hole.
I'm Will Gadd. I'm a climber, guide, adventurer. I've been to some of the craziest places on Earth and climbed some pretty insane stuff, but this is another level.
What a powerful place, eh? Like, just, whoa.
I've never been into any place like this, ever.
Me neither. This is next level for sure.
Nobody has ever dived underneath an ice cap before. I want to get in there and figure out how the water moves through the ice in Greenland.
It is loud in there. That is a massive amount of water, thunder like coming up from the inky blackness down below.
The moulins are basically the thing that connects the surface meltwater to the base of the glacier. And what we're trying to do is understand how those large fluxes of water down into the moulins affects how fast the ice sheet moves, how fast that contributes to the ocean, and then in turn, how fast sea level is going to rise in the future.
Way too much water right now. Ripping down below us. You can see it going for 50, 80 meters straight down below us, and it just disappears into this cauldron of slamming water, and you die for sure down there right now.
Typically, we're not working in these when there's that much water flowing into them, mostly because we can't get anywhere. By the time October rolls around, I think everything's going to freeze up real nice. This waterfall is going to shut down, and we're going to be able to work our way down all the way to where the water backs up in the system.
Yeah, this is looking good. We have potential to do what we want to do, which is go farther under the ice than anybody's ever been, and add a few things to the scientific database about how ice works. This is great. And yeah, I'm looking forward to October.
This is most people's version of a frozen hell out there. It's minus 30, blowing a hoolie. Just setting up camp is really difficult. Our starting place is about as wild as it gets, and then we're gonna bump it up several levels after that.
There's no book on how to dive moulins on top of the Greenland ice cap. Best case scenario, we get there, the ice is stable and good. We can descend a couple hundred meters down into the glacier, and we'll find an ice floor down there on top of the water.
The cave turned out to be totally bigger than we expected. We were expecting a vertical shaft or a crack that dropped straight down to water and was relatively small. Instead, what we found was this enormous room underneath the ice sheet. And that turns out to be really important because those enormous rooms can store massive quantities of water that regulate water pressure at the base of the ice sheet.
You guys see this crack here?
So with glacier caves, there's a lot of dangers that you have to look out for, but we definitely didn't expect this cave to be as broken up as it was. There's one really extra scary block that is basically already fallen over, and it's just kind of hanging there. And then behind us, we've got a bunch of cracks, that are basically in alignment with the block that's overhanging.
Really short version, that ice is all messed up and we are not stoked.
The ice quality was so bad, it really scared me. You know, I'm around a lot of ice, and this ice was not good. Anything that falls in climbing is generally bad. When you're stuck down a hole where the only place that ice can go is toward you, it's horrifying. There's a lot of hazard over your head. Any one point could be critical for your survival. If you don't feel nervous at the bottom of a moulin in Greenland, then you probably ought to get your head examined.
When we went in the first time, the floor was pretty flat. When we went back the next time, there were ice blocks everywhere. It was just a big ice breccia that was all frozen together. Clear evidence of a lot more collapse.
Bottom line, that was not a safe place to be. And the only way to make it reasonable is to minimize your time exposure in it.
So looking up above us, that's all starting to break down.
A lot of adventure and exploration is judging the risks and making good decisions. And for me, the first goal is always to come back.
That's the end of it there. It just goes right to the end. The ceiling comes down right there. And now I think it's an excellent time to leave.
It's really disappointing not to get to dive, especially because we saw a site that was going to be so easy to stage from.
You could not justify diving in that environment. You might be getting your gear on and then get hit by a 2-ton block of ice. And there's just no way to make that worthwhile.
One of the things that's really important about exploration is that until you go into these things, you just have absolutely no idea what they look like. You have no idea how they work.
This trip was one of the most successful trips of my life. I survived, that's great, but we also learned that the model everyone is using for the Greenland ice cap needs revising. We made a genuine scientific discovery here that has an impact on how people look at melt in Greenland. And I got to use my sports to help do that.
We didn't get to dive this time, but we're going to dive one of these things at some point in time.
So I'm not done with this idea. I'm fired up for the future for sure.
Are we back? Hello? Anyway, thank you so much. First of all, that was just like, wow. And you understand why the Explorer's Journal was absolutely gravitating toward the story and why it was the cover of our winter edition. And again, thank you for Red Bull for making this happen. I think I'm going to turn it over to Jason now. And I just have to put in a little editorial note here. Is when I first contacted Jason, I was actually kind of nervous, like, oh, it's Jason Gulley, he's like the guy, and it's Will Gadd, and he's the guy. Can you hear me? And suddenly, hold on just a moment.
You're all good, Angela. Go ahead.
Okay. Anyway, but you could hear me and all that, yes?
Yes, you've been
okay.
on.
I couldn't hear you. For some reason. Anyway, so when I reached out to Jason, I was just kind of nervous about all this, and then he said, "The Explorers Club. Oh, I first got on the ice because I got a grant from your youth activity fund," and I was like, "Bingo!" So he's willing to talk to us. Anyway, I just wanted to say, Jason, I'm turning it over to you.
Hi, thanks, Angela. Yeah, so it's actually a really important point. One of the, when we first started working in glaciers, as an undergrad, I was an undergrad in like 2004, 2005, and I got really excited about working inside of glacier caves. We didn't know anything about glacier caves. We didn't have anybody to go to for funding. one of the problems that we run into a lot in science is that there's a big push to fund, $500,000 machines that go ping. Science is done with sophisticated models or satellite imagery, and there's not a lot of funding opportunities out there to do research that's exploration based. It's very difficult to write a coherent scientific paper when you don't really know what it is that you're looking for. So outside of the deep ocean, there's not a whole lot out there for people to get. So having organizations like the Explorers Club that support research like that allows us to get out there and try to make the discoveries early on that allow us to come back later and get more higher level scientific funding from federal agencies. So one of the things that I always had an eye towards when I first started working in glacier caves was trying to understand what would happen to the Greenland ice sheet as it begins to melt in the future. So the Greenland ice sheet stores enough ice on land to raise sea level by about 7 meters. Now, over the last century or so, since the late 1880s, we've actually physically measured sea level rise on the order of about 8 to 9 inches. Now, if we look at plausible sea level rise scenarios for the future, where we actually have to use models, since we can't measure the future yet, we're looking at sea level rise somewhere on the order of about 0.5 meter to upwards of 1.5 meters of sea level rise by the year 2100. Now, the difference between 0.5 meter of sea level rise and 1.5 meters of sea level rise by 2100 is massive when it comes to coastal planning. So a lot of the work that we're doing in Greenland is trying to refine some of the information that goes into those models that are going to predict how much sea level is going to rise as a result of contributions from the Greenland ice sheet. So currently we're looking at somewhere between about 5 to 33 centimeters of future sea level rise coming just from the Greenland ice sheet alone. And again, a lot of the other uncertainty and the other projections that we were talking about are kind of a result from not really understanding how the Greenland ice sheet is going to respond to future melting. And also, we don't really have a very good understanding of how the Antarctic ice sheet is going to respond to melting as well. So, but let's, when we talk about melting on the Greenland ice sheet, I'm going to go ahead and try to share screens here and pull up some photos on my website. Hopefully this is going to work out okay. So we're going to share, move into a slideshow, full screen. Okay, so hopefully what everybody is looking at, and we should get the little green box at the bottom to go away here in a second. What we're looking at here is a picture of a meltwater lake on the surface of the Greenland ice sheet. And all the way down in the left-hand corner, we have our helicopter shadow for scale. So every summer, the Greenland ice sheet gets transformed from this kind of barren snow-covered wasteland into a beautiful network of these blue ribbons of rivers and enormous lakes. Some of these lakes are so big that in previous investigations, we've actually gone out on them in inflatable boats to do bathymetric mapping. Now, all of this research takes place out of remote camps that we establish out on the ice sheet. So again, here you can see a bunch of tiny little tents and nothing else around us for miles. So, again, when the helicopter takes off, like that's it until the helicopter comes back. So a lot of times we'll spend time sitting around camp talking about what happens if World War III starts again and everybody forgets that we're out there and how we're gonna get off and get to the mountains, which you can see very, very far in the distance. I don't know why, but every glaciology expedition I've ever been on, that comes up sometime about week 3 as a fun topic of dinner conversation. So these meltwater lakes, in addition to showing that the ice sheet is melting, I should point out that over the last several decades, the area of the Greenland ice sheet that's covered by these meltwater lakes is expanded by about 27%. So as temperatures are increasing, more and more of these lakes are forming across the ice sheet. But the lakes also don't just kind of stay in one place. The meltwater kind of grows and expands, overflows boundaries through these like enormous river systems, and then they disappear into these giant holes called moulins. And for all the work that we've done on the Greenland ice sheet, this is pretty much where our scientific knowledge of the ice sheet stopped. We could basically see all of this water pouring into these very inviting holes in the ice, but we didn't really understand anything about what happened once that water disappeared from the surface. So the analogy that I like to use is like if we're trying to understand what happens to the storm sewer of the city of Tampa. I live in Tampa, so if we want to figure out what's happening in our modern storm sewer, the first thing that we do is we go to the city planning commission and we try to figure out what the map of the storm sewers look like, where all the water is going in, where it's coming out, what the diameter of the pipes are. In Greenland, moulins are the actual natural storm sewer of the Greenland ice sheet, but we literally have no idea what happens when the water disappears from the surface. But we do know that it affects how fast the ice sheet moves because we've installed networks of very accurate global positioning systems in various places across the ice sheet. And this is one of Matt's PhD students downloading one of those instruments now. And what we find is that during the day, when we get lots of meltwater flowing into the ice sheet's actually lifting up off of its bed, sometimes tens of centimeters, and it's lurching forward so that the speed of the ice sheet is faster in the day when the ice sheet is melting, and it's slower at night when the ice sheet isn't melting. And at the beginning of the melt season, when all of that meltwater actually starts flowing into the ice sheet actually speeds up sometimes on the order of 200 to 300%. So we know that the meltwater is lubricating the base of the ice sheet and affecting how fast it moves. But what we don't really understand is what's going to happen in the future as moulins start forming in other parts of the ice sheet and lubricating parts of the ice sheet that have never seen meltwater, at least in the last 125,000 years or so. So in order to do that, we actually needed to improve our understanding of what that hydrological drainage system inside the ice sheet looks like, that storm sewer system, and use that to improve models of the hydrology of the Greenland ice sheet. We had a pretty good understanding of how caves had formed and drained glaciers in other places around the world based on work I started doing since 2005. I've done a lot of work in the Everest region, which is actually, if you don't know anything about a subject, going to Everest seems to be like the way of starting something. So we knew literally nothing about glacier caves and decided that Everest was probably the best place to start. And again, this is the summit of Everest here in the background in a cave that's located literally below Everest Base Camp. These caves that we find, at elevations above 5,000 meters, turn out to be very important in regulating how water flows through these glaciers, and they actually seem to be setting the pace of how fast glaciers across the Himalaya are lowering. So we also did a lot of work in Alaska and the Matinouska Glacier. So every fall when I was a graduate student, I would kind of start out in Alaska. I'd spend about a month on the Matinouska Glacier. We'd map caves out there, and a number of big caves, small caves, big giant gaping entrances, super fun. And then I'd go to Svalbard and map caves up there where glaciers were a little bit more thermally analogous. So the ice is very similar to the ice that we have in the Greenland ice sheet. We try to piece together an understanding of how, water was flowing through these glaciers and affecting them. But always what we really wanted to do was get to the Greenland ice sheet. It was just so prohibitively expensive. So over a number of years, Matt and I had applied to the U.S. National Science Foundation as part of a broader study about how water flows through the Greenland ice sheet and affects ice motion. And some of the early proposals that we submitted were like, hey, one of the things that we really know nothing about is what the inside of the moulins look like. And we think it's really important for constraining our models. And the reviews that we would get back would basically say that, like, well, that sounds really dangerous. And also it sounds like adventurism. And, it was always kind of, the first part that it sounded really dangerous was kind of surprising to me because I'd actually been funded by the National Science Foundation as a graduate student and a postdoc to explore caves. But then later, after I knew what I was doing, it was suddenly too dangerous. So that was a little frustrating. But again, it's this kind of perception that comes up often in scientific studies that, real science is done with very expensive pieces of equipment and very sophisticated models. There's not a lot of room anymore in science for exploration type activities. So what Matt and I ended up doing was we actually removed the moulin exploration component of the study, submitted the proposal, and eventually got it funded. And we've been working, getting ready to work in Greenland about the same time, but we were really super sad that like every summer we just sit there and watch all this water pour into the moulins, but we had absolutely no way to investigate it. And that was where we were right up until I got a random email at a conference from Will Gadd. As someone who really enjoys ice climbing, I'm not particularly great at it, but I have a really good time. I knew who Will was, and I was reading the email, and I was like, "There's absolutely no way it's that Will Gadd." And I checked my email, and I was like, "Holy crap, is that Will Gadd?" And I turned and I looked at my girlfriend, and I was like, "Patty, I just got an email from Will Gadd," and she's like, "Oh, that's great, honey. Who's Will?" And and that was kind of what put in motion this whole video that we ended up watching at the beginning of the talk.
Will, do you want to pick it up from here? I mean, it's like.
Yeah, I could pick it up from there. I mean, I was honored to get an email back from Jason Gulley, like the world's preeminent, ice guy. I get an email back, so I was really, really stoked on that. Yeah, maybe I'll share some images and just talk a little bit about it. But it's the thing I'm going to have to live with. The worst part of this is I called it the Greenland Ice Cap, and every time that line hits it's a screen, it's the Greenland Ice Sheet. So I do know better now, thanks to Jason. But it's going to haunt me forever. So yeah, how does this work for me? And it's a little bit different, I guess, because I'm a pro ice climber. That's what I've done for the past 25 years. I've traveled all over the world going ice climbing, everything from icebergs to Niagara Falls. It's, if it's ice, I'm there to climb it. But everywhere I went, there was less ice. People would say, oh, it's so much warmer now. There used to be better ice climbing. This is in Sweden, for example, and we're having to go ice climbing in a mine because it's the only ice in Sweden, when historically there's lots of ice in Sweden. And I just kept having these experiences where I'd bump my head up against this reality that my sport was sort of disappearing, at least for larger and larger chunks of the year. But I think what really drove it home is I went to Africa, as Angela mentioned, and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro with the idea of climbing ice on 7 continents. I thought this would be cool. Like, where's the ice in Africa? I had this map, like, look at that. There's so much ice there. It's going to be awesome. We're going to show up. There's going to be ice everywhere. And we showed up and it looked like that. So map, reality, not so hot. And it really disturbed me, actually, because I was seeing this in my own glaciers in my own country here in Canada in the Canadian Rockies where I live. But this was obviously a global phenomenon, and I thought for sure the ice in Africa, it was going to be fine. And I'm an athlete. I'm not a scientist, obviously, and I'm walking around up there going, why is this happening and what's going on? And I thought the trip was kind of a failure, to be honest, because there was a lot less ice, but we showed these pictures of the ice that was left, and it went global. And all of a sudden I was getting emails and calls from people asking, well, what happened to the ice sheet? You sure this isn't just a natural phenomenon? And I felt pretty unqualified to answer those questions, but it was a way to show climate change happening in kind of real time. And I was interested in that. And it just pulled me in. It was like, wow, there's explanations for this, and how does it work and why? And I found it fascinating. And this is the best graph I could show of climate change that I could find. It's like, I can tell this story. That's all that was left of a massive ice sheet, or I can show the graph. And I'm fully ADD. Graphs, I have the attention span of a squirrel. It doesn't work. I can't pay attention to this, but that image works for people. And I started to get more interested in this idea. And as a guide and climber, I'm out in the mountains all the time, and I'm watching these glaciers disappear. The routes I used to use to access the mountains are not the same. I wouldn't climb many of the routes I climbed as a kid because they're just no longer safe. The ice is falling down, the permafrost is melting. And I started to look around in my home area and try to understand this a little bit more here in the Canadian Rockies. And that's the Athabasca Glacier. And I've always looked at these holes that went down and been curious about them. Like, what's down there? Where do they go? What goes on? And that glacier is now another basically kilometer or so further back than in this photo. It's just receding so quickly. And I was curious about this, like, where does the water go? What happens? And I had no agenda. I just wanted to kind of understand why this ice was disappearing. So I ended up going underneath the Athabasca Glacier. It was a crazy world. It was like caving in a china shop or something. It's just the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and interesting. And how does it work? Why does it form? And I called up a local professor at the University of Alberta, and I asked him, and he was like, we don't really have many images like the ones you're sending me, except from this guy named Jason Gulley. So that'll come in a minute. But he's like, I can send you a graduate student, and maybe I can come out and we can look at these things. So we started exploring the systems underneath the Athabasca Glacier. And it is like canyoneering or caving. And it felt really familiar because it was ice, and it's also caving, which I've done a lot of. And it was fascinating. And we made some genuine scientific discoveries just right there in the Athabasca Glacier. There was a yellow splotch on the wall. And I honestly thought somebody had peed there, and it smelled kind of gross too. And this professor from the University of Alberta was like, no, I think that's a biofilm. So then we ended up doing a couple sampling trips in there, and this combination of bacteria and algae and the way it was working together and what was going on, it had not been seen before. And this was right in my backyard, and it was part of the story about how things were happening. And I'd always thought glaciers were sterile, nothing down there. It turns out they're teeming with life, and they're like Swiss cheese from all this water flowing through it. And that's part of the story of how they're changing and disappearing. And this was just fascinating. We made a really cool little scientific discovery in my backyard, and it also linked into these bigger problems and questions. And I got to go ice climbing, which is what I want to do. And that was, that was pretty cool too. There's always a sporting element in this stuff, and it's just gorgeous. And that's how Jason came into it. And I called him up, and he had all these great photos. And the Greenland Ice Sheet is just the where you go to answer the really big questions and to understand things. And he very graciously is like, yes, let's go there and do this, and I'll teach you how to cave dive, and we'll go dive. Yeah, it was a wonderful idea, and it was genuine exploration, and I love that as well. And its most basic, science and exploration, as Jason said, are kind of the same thing. And so I got to be part of this trip to Greenland to try and understand how the water moved through the ice cap, and use my sport to maybe help Jason a bit. Although in reality, he's very, very good at this, and so is Matt. I was, the idea was I was going to help them, but they were really helping me. Just super talented people and going at it, and impressive on a lot of skill levels. To teach a climber how to cave dive or cavern dive at a reasonable level in like a week, and then go there and do it is pretty impressive accomplishment. So big thanks to Jason and Red Bull for that happening. And then we're down there and we're doing very basic science, measuring the rooms, trying to understand them and what's happening and why. And as Jason said, until then, the model was that it was a relatively small tube, and we found these giant rooms that affect the rate that the water moves through the ice sheet. And I was just thrilled to be part of this, and as an athlete, you don't really get to make contributions that might possibly help our understanding of things. It's a pretty hedonistic activity, or at least self-centered a lot of the time. So this was pretty cool to be part of this, one of the huge highlights in my career. And I'm just really grateful. And, in addition to his many other talents and scientific capabilities, Jason is also an excellent belayer. It's like he's hanging down there below me on this thing and going for it, up for about anything. And big respect for that and everybody on the trip. And it's come down now to me, having seen climate change and being able to share it in a visual way and tell stories that aren't yelling at people, but just showing them what's going on and why. I hope to reach bigger audiences with Jason and Matt's help, and just show this story in a way that people can relate to. And then, we've all got kids, or many of us do. And I want to have an answer from my own kids when they're like, so Dad, what did you do about climate change? And the trip to the Greenland Ice Sheet and the trips to Kilimanjaro, we just did another one, have pretty radically changed how I live my life. I'm trying to fly a lot less, and I've succeeded in that the last year, but going forward, I will as well. And just basic things that we can do to use less carbon and hopefully make our lifestyles a little bit more sustainable. But the first part of that is we've got to get all those people who, and there's a lot of them, and from their viewpoint, it makes sense, who don't see climate change personally because they live in a city. They don't see the glaciers receding like I do. They don't get out there with their families and go, wow, that glacier is like 5 kilometers further back than it was when I was a kid, and show that story. So that's what I'm trying to do, and just very honored and appreciative of the work that Jason and Matt do. These are really smart people that can make a lot more money doing other things. You don't sit your butt on the Greenland Ice Sheet for a month because it's like it's hard time. It's miserable up there, and these guys are doing it, and they're not in the pockets of like big business or something. It's just much respect to them and the other scientists that are involved in this. And I'm very proud to have my name on a paper that Matt and Jason put together. It's like a small tick, but I'm really proud of that, to be part of that process. So thanks very much to them. And if I can help in the future, I look forward to it. And maybe we'll get back to that diving project, and it'll be in a little bit safer environment. So thank you all for that. And look, I really want to go back and keep doing the work you guys do. It's awesome. And I won't call it the Greenland Ice Cap anymore.
Again, so Matt, who is the, you have to understand that Matt comes at this with kind of a different toolkit. He has a background in astrophysics and all kinds of basically exotic mathematical modeling and everything. And I think you're the one, Matt, that sort of said, wait a minute, there should be all these volumes under there. but they can't be possible. So Matt, might you join us in the discussion?
Okay, thank you. And that's exactly where I'm going to start here with my part of the story. I'll have to apologize to Will that I'm going to show a graph, but I promise this is the last one that I'll show.
Horror!
This is taking a couple of steps back in the story science-wise, and looking at, on the left here, we have some of our data from our summer expeditions on the ice sheet, where we were measuring the water levels inside the moulins and how they cycled over daily cycles. And this was one of the first surprising things that we found, was that the daily water level changes were much smaller than we anticipated. On the right here, we have some modeling results where we've run some computer simulations of these types of water cycles within the moulins. And what I found with the model was that I could only make these variations as small as what we were observing if I added a lot of storage. So basically, if I made the moulin volumes really big, then we could match what we were observing. But otherwise, I couldn't find any way of changing the model in order to reproduce what we were observing in the field. And at first, we really thought, like, okay, this is too big. The moulins can't be this big. It's not possible. This volume has to be something else. Maybe it's crevasses or it's something else. But then after Will and Jason went out there on this first expedition, they showed they are really big and actually sort of on the same order of magnitude as what the model was suggesting would be necessary to explain our observations. And with this in hand, and sort of with the demonstration that we could safely explore one of these, we went back to NSF and we were able to get some additional funding from them for an expedition in 2019. And Will wasn't able to make it out with us for that expedition. So it was Jason and I and a friend of ours, David Okel, who's also an experienced expedition caver. And we first flew out there, we landed on the ice and we stepped out of the helicopter. This is in October, when normally the ice sheet is totally in the deep freeze. And we were shocked that it was above freezing. There was liquid water, little puddles around on the ground. And we walked over towards the moulin here, which you can see in this picture, and we could hear a waterfall. And we go that time of year because everything's frozen. It makes it safe to go in the moulins, but there was still liquid water. It was still warm enough that we had a waterfall in the moulin. And we thought we might get totally skunked on this trip. We may not be able to go into this moulin at all. But we started rigging up the ropes. We rigged up a couple of really bomber V threads here. You want that extra boost in confidence as you're edging back over the edge of one of these things. And we were able to rig on the opposite side of the moulin from the waterfall. And in this picture here, I'm just starting to back over the edge. We got the anchors tied up, and Jason kind of looked at me and he's like, "So you want to rig?" And I was like, yeah, okay, I'll rig. And so I got on the rope, and it wasn't completely clear to me whether Jason wanted me to rig because he was too nervous to rig or whether he just wanted to take photos. But I got on the rope and backed over the edge and was looking into this inky blackness, which you can see here. You could hear these booming and crashing sounds coming from down below somewhere. It was pretty intimidating, even having been in a lot of caves and hanging on rope in pits like this. This was an intimidating place. And I encouraged or summoned the courage to go about 20 or 30 meters down until I was seeing some fracture patterns and so on that I wasn't so confident about. Climb back up. It's like, okay, Jason, now it's your turn. You go look at what I was seeing, see what you think. And he went down, went a little bit further. He's like, came back up. Yeah, I think it's okay. Keep on going down. And so then I went back. We kind of gradually summoned our courage and also gradually assessed whether we agreed, is it safe to keep going down in here or not. It turned out to be a 100-meter deep shaft. And we went specifically to this location because it was a place where much larger water variations had been observed in the summer. And it turned out it was actually a smaller moulin than the one that Will and Jason explored before. Still pretty big and pretty impressive hole in the ice, but nothing like the volumes that we were seeing in the other one. This is looking down towards the bottom. The bottom, there's not a great picture of the bottom here, but this is what it looked like. It pinched down and there was a little pool of water there. We weren't actually able to get all the way to this because finally we encountered the waterfall. Most of the way we were able to stay away from it on the opposite wall. This is a picture looking up from near the bottom here. And here we're using caving techniques where we're climbing the rope in the way that a caver would climb the rope. Making a map. One of the days we were working in here, there was a strong wind on the surface. It was nice and sunny, but it was just blowing snow. And this blowing snow was falling down the moulin shaft all day long. And we were just, anytime you looked up, you were just getting slammed in the face by snow. And of course, Jason kept telling me, "Oh, look up again. It looks cool. Look up. I'll take another picture. Look up." At least we got a good picture out of it. But we got pretty coated in snow that day. And so just to wrap this up, we've mapped both of these moulins, and what we found was in the second one, the volume was much smaller. And this is where we had observed much larger water variation. So everything seemed to kind of hang together sort of surprisingly well. Typically with models like this, you expect, it's almost a surprise when they make a prediction that is actually true. Okay, and I'll stop there and we can go into questions.
Angela?
Can you hear me?
There you go. Yep, you're good.
Okay, we're moving into the questions they've come across, and pardon me for looking down and stuff, but they're coming. I have 3 different iPads and everything that's coming across. Jason mentioned the ice sheet moving forward. Is the motion due to the slope of the underlying land, rotation of the earth? Is the direction random, or is there a prevailing direction of the ice sheet movement?
Yeah, ice kind of mostly wants to flow downhill. Now, the bed slope can actually be in some other kind of direction. It doesn't necessarily have to be inclined with the ice surface, but in general, ice wants to move from areas of really large ice thickness to areas of smaller ice thickness. And the reason that the ice sheet is moving is kind of twofold. First, the ice is actually deforming a little bit. So if you were to take like silly putty or syrup or something like that and put it on a plate and turn it to the side, it kind of oozes kind of down the plate. And glaciers are doing that as well. But the way that ice sheets and glaciers tend to move much more efficiently is sliding. And that's where the ice is literally grinding its way across the landscape. And the rate that glaciers slide varies with water pressure at the base of the ice sheet. So the work that we're doing in moulins is trying to understand what controls the water level variations in those moulins that affect how fast the ice sheet is sliding, kind of more or less from the center of the ice sheet out towards the ocean, where you can have icebergs that break off and contribute to sea level rise.
Okay, we have another question from an Evan Krell. Besides traditional measuring, RGB camera, et cetera, what kind of sensors, data collection instruments are used for these studies?
Yeah, so for the cave mapping study, it's still pretty old school with a few modern updates. So because GPS doesn't work under the ice, we have to make a survey from the surface down into the caves, and you do that by measuring the distance between 2 survey points. So you have to have line of sight between 2 survey points, and we measure that with a laser that also has an electronic compass and an inclinometer built into it. It's basically like a LiDAR instrument, but you only get like 1 point at a time. So you can survey between 2 points, and then when you're there, you can shoot multiple splay shots kind of across the room. Matt's got a very sophisticated setup that he uses when he does the survey, and it'll spit all that information directly from the survey device that he's using into a tablet, and he's able to draw everything directly on the screen. So in the moulin, that's what we're using. On the surface, though, we have tons of equipment that's kind of installed all over the place. We have weather stations that are tracking how and when the ice sheet is melting. We have discharge stations built on rivers on the ice that are measuring the water flow into the moulins. We have other sensors that we installed from the surface into the moulins that measure the water level fluctuations during the summer. We have seismometers that measure ice quakes and water flow at the base of the ice sheet, and GPS units, which are kind of the backbone of our research. Very, very accurate GPS units that allow us to see how much the ice sheet is moving on the order of like centimeters at a time.
Okay, so that renders moot one of the questions. Is it possible to put GPS in the water and track it through the rivers under this? I guess not.
No.
Jason and Matt are the GPS. They go down there. They become
They
the
are the
GPS.
So we got a question. Are they mapping with a standard Disto X2? I don't know what a Disto X2 is, but maybe you know what a Disto X2 is?
Yes, we were mapping with the Disto X2. That's the device that Jason was describing with the laser rangefinder, and it measures the compass direction and the inclination of each individual survey shot. And I was sketching on a tablet.
Also have a question about, could you tell us about your research in geomorphology? I don't know. This seems to be aimed at Matt, but I'm not sure what. It doesn't seem very detailed. I'm just saying it's a question. I'm getting them across one of our platforms.
Yeah, so I work in a variety of fields. So in addition to glaciology, I work in hydrogeology and geomorphology, and often at the intersections between those fields. In geomorphology, I mostly work in understanding how caves develop and evolve over time, and particularly trying to understand like the shapes of cave passages and what sort of stories we can read from those by looking sort of mathematically at the processes that are driving that formation.
And I'm going to just throw in a question of my own. I think one of the things that was interesting from our discussions early on in the interview process for producing the cover story for the Explorers Journal was the sort of idea that the ice was actually performing a little bit like karst in its erosion. Did I miss something great there? I mean, you guys are both karst cavers as well as ice cavers. And I'm wondering if, you might be able to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so that was actually what I ended up doing my PhD dissertation research on. So prior to that, a lot of the ideas for how water flowed through glaciers were kind of based on what turned out to be outdated models of how caves form in limestone as well. It was really interesting in that in 1972, when the first paper on glacier hydrology was written, it was written in keeping with how everybody thought caves formed in limestone. But then in 1978, there was a different paper that sent cave hydrology off into a totally different direction. But glaciologists never really got the memo that they were working with this outdated conceptual model. So in caves, people used to think that water would form from kind of flow like through a porous limestone matrix. But then after mapping a number of caves, Derek Ford and Ralph Ewers, they mapped something like 500 caves all around the world, and they found that caves are mostly following fractures and bedding planes. And, I thought that like, well, if we just started mapping, hundreds of caves and glaciers, different types of glaciers around the world, maybe we could figure out if that's how caves are forming in glaciers as well. So that was what I did my dissertation research on. Again, always really, really hoping that I was going to get to do something in Greenland, but was able to show that was kind of controlling cave formation. Fractures were controlling cave formation in glaciers pretty much around the world. But again, it wasn't until Will came in with Red Bull that we were able to show that was what was happening in Greenland as well. you know, as a scientist, it's not very often that we have professional athletes and you know, large companies coming to us asking if there's anything that we'd be interested in doing with them. So we're not really in the same social circles.
I'll just tack onto that a little bit. So basically in karst, what you have is the rock dissolving away. And in glacier settings, you have the ice melting away. And these processes of melting and dissolving are very similar to each other in terms of just even the mathematics of how they work. And so a lot of knowledge and a lot of models are transferable back and forth between these two worlds.
I'm sorry if I'm a little, what is the clothing? Okay, this is a question coming in. What is the make of the clothing gear that you use for going into the ice crevasse? Are there temperature fluctuations that are cause for concern as you use your tools and picks for maintaining your equilibrium? How do you record your data inside the rigs? How alarmed should we be by these receding glaciers? This is like a multi-part question. My guess is either all three of you are welcome to answer any part of that as you see fit.
I'll take a stab at the parts of it that I'm you know, as an Arc'teryx sponsored athlete, it has to be Arc'teryx. Nothing else will stand the rigors of that situation down there. No, I know. I mean, the clothing is a big part of it because you have to stay dry enough and functional enough and have enough dexterity to work ice screws and things like that. So that's just being comfortable in those temperatures is really hard. Normally when you're caving, it's maybe, you know, somewhere usually, you know, a relatively benign temperature range, whereas these caves are very, very cold and it's miserable. And then the way the ice responds to ice tools is really different because there's a huge temperature gradient between the surface ice and the ice inside the Greenland ice sheet. And I wasn't familiar with this temperature gradient. In the Athabasca, it's relatively homogeneous. But in the Greenland ice sheet, you could hit it and this fracture would go like across the whole side of the wall. It was one of the scariest things ever. Yeah, you guys are laughing. Jason and Matt are both laughing because they're like, they've been there. They've seen this happen. It's horrifying. You think the whole thing's going to fall down on you. It's terrible. And my nose is actually just bloodied from climbing on ice that had a big surface temperature differential. And I hit it too hard. It hit me in the face. So anyhow, living that experience in other mediums as well. So I mean, that's kind of the ice part of it. I think that the technical parts should be left to the experts. I'm not a glaciologist, even though I was interested in you know, glaciology. I'm not that. These are the world's experts on it.
Yeah, your description about being terrified when the wall kind of just splinters was, you know, I vividly remember the first time that happened to me in Nepal, right? I was looking at this high level lead that I wanted to go check out and I started to climb the wall and I swung my ice axe into it and there was like this giant explosion and everybody just like dropped to the ground. And then like after a couple of seconds, like nothing happened and we're like, everybody's fine? Yeah, okay. And then Doug Ben, the glaciologist that I was working with at the time, he kind of put together the whole temperature gradient story. And then after that, we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And we just kind of got used to the wall exploding.
Okay, I think we're sort of beginning to wrap this up, but one of the things is, one more question we got is, surely they are not planning to go diving at the bottom of these moulins. Wouldn't it be better to explore them with like, you know, an AUV or something like that? And the other thing is, I want to know, you've told us both, or the three of you, or I know that Jason and Matt have said, there is so much more to do here and you need to get the funding for it. Can you actually just give us a bit more about where you see this going?
Yeah, so we actually did originally plan on diving in the moulin for a couple of reasons. First of all, you know, it's super cool exploration. You know, it's very, very difficult, and it would be super neat if we did. Also, there's a you know, a really good science reason for doing it as well. So when the water at the end of the melt season, the area of the moulin that's actually occupied by water over summer is underwater by the time that we can access it because the water starts backing up into the moulin. So if we want to know what the full volume of the moulin looked like during summer, the only way that we're ever going to be able to see it is to make observations underwater. Now, we've still got another 400 or 500 meters of water before we hit the bed of the ice sheet. And there's no way anybody's ever going to be able to dive that. So, there's clear, there's clear reasons to use like a ROV or some other type of submersible for those types of areas of research. But for the shallower stuff, like if you can physically get into an environment, you have the ability to make observations that you can't make remotely. For example, there's a reason most marine biologists that are studying shallow coral reefs aren't using ROVs to do it. It's because you don't have the ability to experience the environment. You don't have the ability to say, hey, that looks really neat. I want to go over and like touch it and feel it and look at it from like 6 different directions or whatever and try to understand it. It's kind of the, I think ROVs are often seen as diver replacements, whereas I think that they're different tools for different jobs. But yeah, going forward, the research that we've done so far has opened up a lot of big questions for us. Like, so for example, we've been in a couple of these big moulins, but for example, we have no idea what the size of moulins, size distributions of moulins are in other areas of the ice sheet. Are the ones that we're looking at, are they particularly big or small? We don't know. We kind of semi-randomly picked a couple of them. The whole moulin that we ended up working in on the Red Bull project was picked with 15 minutes of helicopter time because the moulin that we'd spent a year planning, poring over satellite imagery to look at was buried in snow in 2017 when we established our first field camp, because it was a very, very cold year. And the snow line hadn't migrated far enough up glacier for us to safely establish a camp. So we had to find an alternative as we were flying back to the ice margin. And again, we've been able to make small explorations of areas that are air filled, but again, the water filled sections are completely unknown. So we have no idea what the water filled sections of the moulins look like, or how to even model the types of processes that are forming them. So there's a lot of different types of work that we can do inside moulins. And again, we're all currently looking for ways to get back there and do some of that work.
All right. Well, I think this has been absolutely fantastic. And I guess we're going to pretty much close. I would like to let people know that on March 29th, a week from tonight, we have the next presentation, In Search of New Worlds with Neil Price and Lawrence Bergreen. I'm just letting our viewers know. But anyway, I think this has just been a very frosty introduction to a very scary place. And is there anything else I forgot to ask you or that you want to just say in closing?
I just said thank you for putting this together and for the questions. And Matt and Jason, I hope I get to do something interesting with you in the coming years. I've got some ideas. It sounds like you do. So we should do some more of this. Like listening to your stories and looking at what you're doing. I'm getting fired up again. So yeah, look for another email. You guys are awesome. Thank you very much. And the Explorers Club also, there's a lot of friends of mine there who may be on this. And thank you for having us as well.
Super cool. Well, anyway, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Allison, for your introduction. Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Matt. And thank you, Will. And thank you, Red Bull, for making the video possible. This was like no shortage of emails going round and round to make sure we could actually share your fabulousness with the world. So anyway, good night from the Explorers.